The bombing of a hospital in Gaza leaves hundreds dead and hundreds more injured. Israeli forces and Hamas militants trade blame over the attack as leaders around the world voice their outrage and call for accountability. United Nations Chief Antonio Guterres has called for a stop in hostilities between Israel and Hamas so that aid can enter the Palestinian enclave in the wake of the hospital bombing.
I am horrified by the hundreds of people killed at Al-Ahli Hospital this same day in Gaza by a strike that I strongly condemned earlier today. I call for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire to provide sufficient time and space to help realise my two appeals and to ease the epic human suffering we are witnessing.
Mr. Guterres' comments come hours ahead of a UN Security Council emergency meeting, which will discuss the hospital attack and Brazil's draft resolution for a humanitarian pause in Gaza. Head of the World Health Organization, Tedros Ghebreyesus, has called on all warring parties to stop violence in the Palestinian enclave. He warns that the situation is spiraling out of control and wants to start delivering life-saving supplies into the territory immediately. The WHO chief says that medical aid has been stuck at the border with Egypt for the past 4 days. The European Union, meantime, says there is no excuse for hitting a hospital full of civilians. Foreign Policy Chief Josep Borrell says that the responsibility for the hospital strike must be clearly established and the perpetrators held accountable. The Arab world is blaming Israel for carrying out that attack. Protesters took to the streets in Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan and Iran. Egypt says the bombing was deliberate and is a clear violation of international law. Saudi Arabia has denounced Israel for continuously attacking civilians. The United Arab Emirates and Bahrain, who had established ties with Israel in 2020, have similarly put the blame on Israel. The United Kingdom's Foreign Minister James Cleverly has warned against jumping to conclusions. He says blaming the wrong group for the hospital attack could put even more lives at risk.
And for more on this, we're joined by Professor Simon Mabon. He is Professor of International Politics at Lancaster University. Professor Mabon, we're hearing from your Foreign Minister calling for cooler heads right now. And of course, prior to crossing to you, our correspondent was speaking about the delicate balancing act that Mr. Biden faces on this trip to Israel. Now, up to a point, if he wants to ease tensions in this region, and they're a tinderbox right now, he has to show that he has the moral weight to adjudicate, in some sense, between two violently divided sides. At this point, to speak of, and I quote him, the other team. Where does that leave global engagement right now on this conflict?
Thank you for having me, first of all. And I think that's a really important point that you raise in terms of the moral credentials and the moral ability to speak, to condemn violence, and to place this idea of a shared humanity front and center within the context of an increasingly violent, brutal, devastating conflict that has become all-encompassing. The untangling of this, the various narratives that are at play, the diplomatic dimensions that are at play, the role of international actors, the divisions that are inherent within the Israeli side and the Palestinian side, all of this, when you put it together, you get a complex set of precarious dynamics, precarious relations. And the only way to acquire any type of moral credentials, I think, is to stress humanity, to place a shared humanity front and center in any diplomatic initiatives, and to condemn violence. Unfortunately, the devastating repercussions of geopolitical aspirations are making that incredibly difficult for Mr. Biden and indeed for others engaging with this conflict right now.
Well, the condemnation of violence, for each side, they would condone that by saying we have grievances that stretch into decades. So if we inflict any death and terror now, that is well and truly justified. how can anyone at this point step back from this and say it is an objective, an observable fact that we have had occupation, we have had blockades. On the other hand, we have also seen extreme violence on the 7th of October that has taken, quote, innocent lives. Two accounts that are not mutually exclusive. They are also necessarily true. Is there any diplomatic position that makes allowance for both these positions and the grievances of both sides that take these positions?
I think that's incredibly well put, this idea of a competing set of narratives that are not mutually exclusive. We have seen an objective reality whereby Palestinians are under occupation and have been under a blockade in Gaza for the past 16 years. At the same time, we have seen the killing of innocent civilians in Israel. These two narratives are empirically verifiable. They are objectively true. They are also politically charged and set at odds with one another. And I think the only way out of this, and it is an incredibly difficult way out of this, is to focus on a diplomatic initiative that puts shared humanity front and center. Because if we strip out the politics, strip out the religious dimension, strip out ethnicity, what you have is a collective humanity. And this, of course, is incredibly idealistic, of course, and the practicalities of this are incredibly challenging, but finding that shared position, that shared stance, is the only way to get out of this without it escalating further. Because right now, the politics, the religion, the competing narratives, the competing claims to legitimacy, the competing histories, the discourse, the rhetoric are all becoming increasingly politically and geopolitically charged. And untangling it is becoming incredibly difficult. And yet that is precisely what needs to happen in order for there to be any type of ceasefire, to get humanitarian aid in, and to talk about the next steps beyond just getting a ceasefire. Because this is, as you say, part of a much bigger set of issues that date back decades, centuries, and some would even say millennia.
All right, the final question here, Professor Mairon. Mr. Biden's visit, it's not going to be achieving what has not been achieved in decades of genuine effort. But if we're looking at strategy, of course, it's easy to say in retrospect, Israel had no real strategy on the Gaza Strip for a very long time. But now if the U.S. wants to build on Israeli strategy, giving support and therefore perhaps trying to encourage Mr. Netanyahu and his coalition government to take the right steps to de-escalate what's happening right now, what might we look forward to, difficult as this may be, in terms of practical diplomatic steps in the next few weeks? Final question.
It is difficult, very difficult, as you say, in part because of the various divisions within Israeli society. But if we're looking at practical steps, there are a number of things, I think. The first is to get access to humanitarian aid that is in Egypt and is currently unable to get into Gaza. There are 2.2 million people in dire need of food, water, electricity, and medical supplies. Getting that in would be an important first step. The next step would be a de-escalation in terms of the language that's being used. We heard Mr. Benjamin Netanyahu talking about opening the gates of hell when this operation started. Now, that, of course, is deeply problematic and it fuels this idea of division. And I think calling for restraint, calling for a reconsideration of the language that's being used to talk about the other is important, and it can contribute to working towards a ceasefire. And that can then, assuming that all of this falls into place, and this is where it gets even trickier, start to reinitiate a diplomatic engagement. But of course, there we get into questions of what is actually at stake here. Is it the idea of a two-state solution that has been called into question, or is it something else, something more creative? And then we go back to the debate and the issues that we were talking about earlier with regard to politics, religion, ideology, divisions between and within the various camps. And it becomes incredibly murky. This is not an easy process whatsoever. But getting aid in is the first and most important step right now.
Thanks for joining us. Simon Mabon, Professor of International Politics at Lancaster University.